I'm looking forward to our lesson today, and I want to thank you for joining in our scripture series as we come to our second lesson in Nehemiah. Nehemiah is one of my favorite storylines in the Old Testament, of several favorites, I suppose. But I think you'll find yourself really taken as we, week by week, see the very real issues that Nehemiah faces that we face as well. Let's just get our baseline. Nehemiah is in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire, and he's Jewish. And that part of the world under the Babylonians that the Persians had conquered, they had exiled Jewish people when Jerusalem was destroyed. And so Nehemiah, he is there in Persia, and some of his friends came back from Jerusalem, and they said to me, those who survived the exile, so that's when the Babylonians destroyed the temple and exiled people, those that are back in the province are not doing well. These words never describe our lives well: trouble and disgrace. Sometimes that's where we do find ourselves, honestly. But they become starting points. And why trouble and disgrace? Well, two things. First of all, the wall and the gates. The wall of Jerusalem is broken, and the gates have been burned with fire. And so as we've been seeing, this is a picture of, if the walls are gone, there's no identity and boundary to the city, and it's vulnerable to the intrusion of the enemy. And if the gates are burned, that's where so much of business and city politics was transacted. So you have vulnerability and dysfunction. That's a little review from our last lesson. And so that sets up the scene for what will be a rebuilding process. And today we're going to talk about the two things that are key. The first two things, we'll say, there'll be a third one next week, but the first two things that are key to rebuilding. Or if you don't sense like you're right now needing to rebuild out of a lot of brokenness in your life, we're still all need to keep facing challenges. This is what stretches us. I never want to live safely. I never want to stop taking risks, trying something new that I've never done before, in a way I've never done it before, to really keep growing into God's potential for my life. So it may not be rebuilding of brokenness, but it may be facing challenges. And it will always boil down to two things. First of all, favor from God, plus faith. These are the two things we're going to see transact in Nehemiah chapter 2. Remember that word favor? Because this is where rebuilding begins. It's leaning on the favor of God. And at the end of Nehemiah's prayer, right at the end of chapter 1, because he started, as we always ought to, laying the groundwork of prayer, first of all, he ends his prayer by saying, Lord, I'm volunteering to become the answer to my prayer. If you can use me to make a difference in Jerusalem, I'm volunteering. But it's going to take favor in the presence of this man. That man was the king. And Nehemiah was a cupbearer. That brought Nehemiah into direct proximity with the king. And there's some tradition that a cupbearer would even taste the wine before serving the king, so that if it was poisonous, the cupbearer would die and not the king. So Nehemiah had this really interesting and very trusted relationship with the king. But he still realized these kings are very arbitrary. If they're unhappy about something, they could just have you killed in an instant. So he said, I'm going to need favor. Let's look first of all at this idea of favor. Is that even a New Testament concept, having the favor of God in your life? Well, yes, we see that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. The word there is charis in the Greek. charis. We get charismatic from there. We get charisma, charitableness from there. And it's sometimes translated grace. And really, grace is God's favor towards us. He doesn't turn his face from us, but he turns his face in favor towards us. The New Testament church, Acts 2. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. So they had large group meetings, and they broke bread in their homes. They had small group meetings. They ate together. They enjoyed being with each other. They experienced unity. They were praising God. God's Spirit was moving, and they were enjoying the favor of all the people. And all the people would be people outside the church. And the Lord consequently added to their number daily those who were being saved. Because favor is like, it opens doors. Favor gives us hearing. Favor allows people to be open to us. When God puts His favor on our lives in ways in which we can leverage influence, and God can use us. I remember going to a church on the West Coast and pastoring it, and it had been some turmoil, and people were saying, how are you going to fix it? And I had no idea. But before I go up and preach Sunday morning, I'd lie on the floor in my office on my face and say, God, I have no idea how to fix this place, but I need your favor. I need your grace. And it was those years that I really felt like the Lord began to teach me about walking in the favor of God. In fact, God opposes the proud, Peter tells us, but shows favor to the humble. And this is what Nehemiah prays for. He prays, Lord, I'm going to need the favor of God in my life if I'm going to face this challenge, if Jerusalem's going to be able to rebuild again. And so out of all the devastation in our lives, we start with the favor of God. And He gives favor to the humble. Well, that's how Nehemiah is feeling here. He'd been praying, fasting, weeping, and yet he's having to bring wine to the king. And the king notices that he's kind of raining on the party, Nehemiah is. Because, your mood can affect a whole room. And so the king points this out in chapter 2. Nehemiah writes, I, Nehemiah, was much afraid. I mean, it's going to take some courage. If you never take a risk, you're never going to need God's favor. But if you're going to change, if you're going to take on new challenges, or if you're going to confront your past and start rebuilding out of the destruction of your past, it's going to take some courage. And it's not bad to be afraid of the unknowns ahead of you. Nehemiah was afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Just have some respect here. Why should my face not look sad when the city, that city was Jerusalem, where my ancestors, that's the Jewish people, are buried and lies in ruins? So the ruins would be the walls, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. My whole ancestry, everything that my people had hoped for is lying in ruins. So why should I not be afraid? And so the king, asks him some questions. And here's the end of the story. Because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. Because after Nehemiah said, well, why shouldn't I be sad given all this? Then Nehemiah, the king said, well, what do you want to do? And Nehemiah said, I'd like to go back. And the king then asked, well, how long will we be gone? And when will we be returning? And Nehemiah tells him, I don't know if he was right about the returning, because it would be 12 years before he would return again. And the king provides. And then, well, what will you need? Well, I'm going to need some lumber. I'm going to need supplies. I'm also going to need safe passage. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king actually granted my request. That's the favor of God. Gracious hand of God on us, that's favor. That's another way of saying God's favor was on my life. I want to challenge you today to really believe for the favor of God on your life. That's how the rebuilding began. And Nehemiah was able to return to Jerusalem. And then he arrives in Jerusalem. It's a 4 or 5 month journey. And then comes the second piece of facing challenges. You depend on the favor of God, and then you have to face reality, but you see beyond it by faith. So it's going to be favor plus faith. Because what happens, Nehemiah says, I arrived in Jerusalem after 4 or 5 months of travel. I spent 3 days just settling in. I didn't even tell anybody why I was in town. But by night, when other people were sleeping, I went out through the Valley Gate. This is one of the burn gates in Jerusalem, towards the Jackal Well, a water source, and the Dung Gate. This is another one of the gates in the southern part of the city. Examining the walls of Jerusalem. I was examining the walls. And of course, the walls are just rubble. These were the walls that had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. So here he sees it for what it is. It says that some places the rubble, in the next few verses, the rubble was so intense and there was so much of it that his horse couldn't even pass through. And he had to take detours. And I could imagine that this was overwhelming. I mean, just to see the rubble for what it was. But Nehemiah wanted to see it. Before he started laying out plans to rebuild the gates and the walls, he just surveyed the rubble. But the overwhelming nature of all of these obstacles, all of these broken stones, all of these burnt places did not discourage him. Because he saw the rubble, but he saw past it to what God could do. And that's what we do when we try to rebuild broken places in our lives. We don't live in denial, but we look to that. And sometimes this is a heart process that other people aren't tuned into yet. He said the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I mean, so far I hadn't told anybody because I just kept quiet. I mean, these were the Jews, these were the priests, these were the nobles, these were the officials. I didn't tell anybody who I knew would end up doing the work of rebuilding. God's time would come for them at the right time. Sometimes when faith is being gestated in our hearts, it's not something we go out and just talk about to everybody else, because it doesn't come from other human beings. Jesus is working faith. We get over the denial of our need to rebuild. We face the rubble for what it is, but we see beyond it with the eyes of faith to what God can do and will do. And that usually starts at a very personal level. However, for us to really rebuild or take on new challenges, most of us, it's never God's plan, we do it alone. So in the very next verse, after saying, I didn't tell anybody, but I rode my horse in the middle of the night, this is all, I just had to see for myself. And yet he found faith gestating in his heart. So the very next verse, then I said to them, all these leaders, he did pull them together. And you see the trouble we're in. Let's face reality, let's not deny it. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. There it is, ruins and fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. This is his charge. Now, he's going to take on the greatest challenge of his life. And here's how he frames it. Let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And he invites partnership, just like you and I, when we're rebuilding broken places in our lives. We invite prayer partners. We invite accountability partners. We invite mentors. We invite teachers. We invite just friends so we're not alone. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And he gives them a vision of what God can do. We're in disgrace and trouble right now, but we can see a day where that's no longer the final word on our lives. And I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king said to me. So he talked to them about favor as he called them on to faith that had already been growing in his own heart. So it's favor plus faith. That's it. Favor plus faith. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. I love those words. Okay, let's do it. May that be our heart and our attitude. So they began this good work, and that launches what will follow of this amazing rebuilding of the gates and the walls. So I hope you have some takeaways as you think about challenges you want to take on or broken places you want to rebuild in your life. And here are a few of mine. First of all, beyond good planning, God's favor makes all the difference. And then secondly, it is going to take courage and risk taking. Remember Nehemiah said, I was afraid when the king saw me raining on his party, and I looked so depressed and everyone was supposed to be so happy. It took courage and taking of risks. That's got to be a growing part of our lives if we're going to change. And then this is always the great truth. Faith does not deny reality. It's not pretending reality isn't there. It's facing reality, but seeing past it to what God can do. Maybe you have takeaways of your own. May God bless you as you ponder these things, discuss these things, and as you take on new challenges in your own life.